This video is for Chapter 8. It's Part 1. And Chapter 8 deals with the concept of gender. The idea of gender may seem a bit difficult to reconcile with the idea of sexuality. Pretty clearly, the two may diverge in significant respects. Sexuality may be something that is considered innate, as we'd seen in prior chapters, where gender may be more a choice of a set of behaviors. Now, gender might seem much like sex to consist of two specific polarities, but in fact it might be more different, just like with sex. And so gender may be said more accurately to be part of a continuum, where you could see extremes, but you see subtle gradations of differences from one end to the other. The idea of polarities, much like with that famous book, or at least its title, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, may miscast things, that it suggests that there are only those two particular poles. And the feminist movement might be one of those which would consider the polarity like that rather simplistic. I think in part, not necessarily because of its bipolar nature, but more of the expectations that come with a gender, such as the way in which social relationships evolve with a particular kind of gender. So, figuring along a continuum here, it would be different types of gender roles. So gender looks at one's social position or overt behavior. Sexuality would be something more like identity or sexual preferences. And sex might be something innate or biological. Granted, all of those terms have different degrees to them, and so to suggest that there is one or the other status in any of those three categories may miss a point, or at least miss out on certain levels of information. Consider sex as a function of a society, therefore that it is a kind of a process, and that in some instances you need to go beyond the binaries of male-female. One of the questions about the polarities is, why is it that men seem to get more out of those relationships from a societal perspective, even though there shouldn't be any real difference? Sure, there's differences in behaviors, but nothing about those behaviors necessarily make them innately one position or another. Look at the idea that sexuality has to be, or gender has to be, one or the other, because that's a concept that may not necessarily have been common in history. In fact, the whole idea of gender may be something that has arisen only in the last century and a half or so. Look at it from the perspective of the idea of essentialism, which talks about differentiating between social phenomena and natural ones. So you might see biological determinism as an example of a natural one, where one's innate physical structure, one's sex, if you will end up meaning that a person has a particular role to play in a society. That who you are in the natural world will end up saying what you'll be, what your relationships will be in the social world. Medical experts continue to hew towards the biological models, or the bipolar models of one or the other, even though we may have children who are born where the sexual identity is not very clearly specified, looking solely at sex. What are the kinds of things that we would associate with gender? If you will, what does it take to be a man or a woman? Look at a list of these particular ideas. For example, the idea of patterns of behavior that would be associated with it. Note that there's the possibility of cultural differences there. You might also have differences in terms of expectations, how gender identity constitute the basic building blocks of a society, and how gender helps an individual to shape or to form a particular identity. Note that the bipolar arrangement of gender is not necessarily a universal one. You'll find that there are different cultures where there is a third gender, if you will, that's possible. within a particular community. It almost challenges or is an affront to the idea of the bipolar view that's common in the Western world. Look at the way in which gender and what constitutes a particular gender has changed over time. That when you look at a society that is maintaining a level of subsistence, the idea of having more on your body than others might suggest a level of wealth. So if you look at the paintings of Paul Rubens, you see that the voluptuousness of the women there, which earns the term Rubenesque, really bespeaks a level of richness, that you have these women who look of a certain dimension being the beneficiaries of a richer society or a richer status in society. Understanding, of course, that if this is the norm, that ends up being something that people would aspire to. So when you look at it in our current times, the idea of resisting the plenty that's available in terms of food, so that we end up idealizing those who might be consuming less as the norm, becomes a standard that people wish to idealize and aspire to. Look at the way in which gender differences are today. Think of masculinity as hegemonic masculinity, that the hegemon is going to be the standard, and that it will establish a certain level of dominance. So it's not merely that masculinity has associated with it certain types of behaviors, but that it also seems definitionally to push out in a certain way. It ends up effectively subsuming femininity. As a result, you'll end up seeing gender roles which might hew towards one particular position or the other, based on this idea of one having power and the other not. Consider how women are supposed to manage their gender in a society. In a society where you have hegemonic masculinity, you're seeing a patriarchy, where by definition masculinity rules. So it's going to mean that femininity is going to be subjective or subservient. What you end up doing is asking the larger question, as Rubens does, of a sex or gender system, that what it does is mold the basic biological materials of sex into some sort of asymmetrical gender statuses that in the final count, because of associations with nature, women are seen as less dominant. Talcott Parsons talks about sex role theory and structural functionalism, that labor is divided according to certain necessary functions, and that sex role theory ends up assigning towards women the responsibility or the task of preparing the next generation of workers. If you look at the psychoanalytic theories, you end up seeing gender being something that springs forth from early gender-related interactions between the infant and the mother and father. Perhaps the biggest criticism, or the strongest criticism to that argument, is the lack of empirical evidence to support this, that it's a good theory, but actually seeing it play out might be rather difficult. A researcher by the name of Nancy Chodorow asks, what is it about women that makes them the primary caregivers? What happens when their role is split up so that men are also caregivers? Carol Gilligan, talking about her observations based on what happens in a playground, watching boys and girls in their different types of play, that boys engage in complicated games and girls tend to emphasize cooperative play. Consider, too, conflict theories, the work of Hartman and McKinnon. Look at the way in which look at patriarchy from the perspective of capitalism, so that there's a benefit to having women being dependent upon men. Amongst other things, it means that having subordinates in the form of women allows men to accomplish more, to be, if you will, richer. since they have somebody who can do the kind of basic work that needs doing for a society to function. You might then look at the micro-interactionist theories of people like West and Zimmerman, who look at the idea of gender not being anything that comes forth innately, but rather being the product of interactions, and that as a result it might be something that is more malleable, that it is not a reflecting of a fixed identity. Look at the experiences of black feminists, and part of the difficulty that they encounter, if you will, think of how there's not just the issue of race, but of feminism itself, that the whole idea of feminism presumes white middle-class women, and so this ends up putting black feminists and their subjects at a double disadvantage, being even more subservient. And then there's a series of postmodern theories which talk about how the polarities of men and women are something that seem to be somewhat more associated with Western kinds of thinking. Finally, looking at the middle range approaches, that Connell builds off of Merton's approach, that the social and personal always depend on each other, that there's a kind of a feedback loop at work. Let me pause here and save this particular recording and then pick up for the second part of the Chapter 8 lecture.